African slavery has its roots in intertribal warfare. Small tribes throughout Africa would go to war in a constantly shifting battle for power and land. Those that were conquered were absorbed or completely extinguished by their conquerors. Out of the survivors, many were turned into slaves working within the fields of their owners' domains. However, unlike the traditional definition of European slavery, slaves within Africa had some social status and rights. In some tribes, they could marry, own land, and even own other slaves. The slavery known to most people today was born with the introduction of Europeans to the opportunities of African labor. With the invention of the new exploration technology, the Portuguese traveled to the western coast of Africa in search of gold. Not only did they find this prized material, but they also brought home a new source of labor, the African slave. The Portuguese built well-established trading posts up and down the coast dedicated to gold and slaves. African slaves were usually sold to the Portuguese by their conquerors or kidnapped directly by the Portuguese. Millions of slaves would be sold into the European market and eventually the American market.
Roll, Jordan, roll, my soul arise.
After the introduction of slave labor to the Europeans, the American colonies needed a new source of labor. They were in need of plantation agriculture labor. Soon, indentured servants would work on these plantations for up to 7 years, but after the 7 years, these servants would become regular citizens. Eventually, the colonists realized that these indentured servants were too costly. But in 1619, the Dutch introduced the first captured Africans to Jamestown to aid the production of the luxurious tobacco. This would plant the seeds of a slavery system threat that evolved into a cruel and horrible practice that would eventually divide the nation. The Middle Passage was a transatlantic voyage of African slaves to the Americas. The Middle Passage was one part, or leg, of the triangle trade. Europeans would travel to Africa and kidnap slaves from their homes or trade with dominant African tribes. The Europeans would load the slaves onto their ships and take them to different parts of North America. The Middle Passage was a very long and agonizing journey for the slaves. They were treated poorly by the Europeans. The slaves were branded with hot irons and resisted by shackles. The living quarters of the slaves were often shelves laying shoulder to shoulder, with no room to move. Faced with these horrible conditions, many slaves preferred to die instead of live.
In the large-scale slave trade network, the amount of slaves sent to colonial British North America was extremely small. In fact, only about 4% of slaves in the network ended up there. Most slaves grew sugar in Brazil or in the West Indies. Within the colonies, the demand for slaves was much higher in the South. This is mainly due to the fact that crops such as tobacco and rice were very labor-intensive. The quantity of slaves got to be so large that by the start of the Revolutionary War, 3/5 of South Carolina's population was entirely slaves, and 2/5 of Virginia's population were slaves. The collective percentage of slaves in the North, 2 to 3% of the population, was extremely low. However, in large cities such as Boston and New York City, about a quarter of the population were African slaves. In the cities, slaves did jobs that were not centered around agriculture. Jobs ranged from being housekeepers and craftsmen to sailors and coachmen. However, no matter the profession, one thing stayed the same. Slaves were property that could be bought and sold at leisure. Even though Southerners had a larger proportion of their profits coming from slave work, many Northerners had their ownership of slaves tied into their money-making as well. Many crops were grown in the southern colonies, such as sugar, rice, and corn, but cotton was the chief moneymaker due to the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. The cotton gin revolutionized the southern colonies. Millions of acres of land had been turned into cotton production. As more and more cotton lands came under cultivation, the demand of slaves increased. Slaves worked all sorts of jobs throughout the slaveholding South, but the most profit of the slaves worked as field hands on large plantations. Men, women, and children served as field hands. The slaves would work on these plantations from sunrise to sundown. At the end of the day, slaves would take their baskets of cotton to be weighed. If they didn't reach the expected amount, they would be whipped. Slavery in the North was not as prominent as it was in the South for numerous reasons, including the environmental and religious restrictions. Due to these facts, slavery became obsolete in the North and it was eventually abolished in most colonies. Although Africans may have been free in the North, by no means were they equal to whites. Black people faced varying levels of discrimination and injustice through the northern colonies. Even the limited rights they had were often denied by whites and therefore held no jurisdiction. Despite ownership of freedom papers, black men and women were always threatened by the prospect of being kidnapped and sold back into slavery. As a result, Africans were rarely able to truly prosper and were confined to lives of basic labor. Southern slavery was extremely common. This was mainly because the crops grown there, such as rice and tobacco, required a lot of tending to, meaning a lot of workers were needed. From colony to colony, the rights of slaves varied, but they all essentially had similar ideas that were titled as slave codes. Slaves were considered property, therefore they were not allowed to have property of their own, and those not living on the plantation were kept under strict supervision. In addition, slaves had zero chance of winning a case against a white, as they were not allowed to plead their side of the story in court. Slaves were forbidden from being educated, because this could help them escape. However, many learned to read through Christianity. The continuous increase of slaves resulted in new rebellion after new rebellion. Consequently, the already strict slave codes became even more harsh, making the lives of the slaves harder than it needed to be. The majority of slaves remained slaves for life. However, in some cases there was opportunity to become free. There were a few ways for a slave to become free. Primarily, a slave could run away in hopes of reaching the north. This option had a high risk but also a high reward for those that succeeded. In addition, slaves could buy their freedom or be emancipated by their masters. Both were considered rarities. Due to this, several slave rebellions occurred. These rebellions, such as the Stono Rebellion and the New York Slave Rebellion, showed the slaves' will for freedom and lack of acceptance of the bad lives they were forced to live. Colonial slavery would become one of the most defining and lamented institutions in the history of the U.S. The racism and prejudice towards African Americans conceived from it still plague American society today. The forced removal of Africans from their homes, destruction of their culture, and the harsh treatment towards them are some of the worst violations of human rights. However, much progress has been made since then. With the complete emancipation of all American slaves and the eventual banning of segregation, Africans were able to become true Americans, all rights and privileges included. Thanks to various civil rights movements and empowering individuals, African Americans are now able to enjoy the prosperity and opportunities of other Americans.